Well, we are talking about the life and legacy of APT James. We started last show highlighting, and today we're going to continue and get a little more detail, not only from me, but it's my privilege to introduce to you this evening a member of APT James' family. His grandson is actually on set with me, and we are going to dialogue about his life from the family's perspective. Alfonso P.T. James III. I introduced him to the show at this time. Alfonso.
Hi, pleasant good evening, Mr. Phillips. Nice to be here.
Yes. So, Alfonso, you have been really and truly trying to disseminate more and more information about APT James for audiences that are now coming to appreciate. And the point I want to start off with is the fact that I would like to get your own feedback on how you see this effort on the part of the government to name a new fast ferry to be delivered this month to add to the sailing schedule, a new fast ferry for the route named after APT James.
I must congratulate the government on the initiative, and it has already been done, Mr. Phillips. It's signed, sealed, and delivered. I mean, it's in our name. It's in the name of the government, right? It's already signed over. It's on its way here.
Yes.
And they provided information of the tracking of the ferry. I think the last time it was somewhere coming from African country, coming through some streets and so on its way, and they actually charted the path to show you where the ferry is, and you could track it on your own to know how long it'll take to get here.
Right.
All right. Very, very good initiative, because since I've been growing up, you know, it had the MV Tobago, it had the Hummingbird, the Gelton, and these kind of vessels that used to make people throw up 7 times throughout the journey. I've traveled on those vessels, and we've leased other vessels like the Sonia. That was one of the best ones I'd ever passed through. It had an escalator, the only vessel with an escalator.
Right.
Nice air condition and stuff, cabins, you know, with showers and that sort of thing.
Well, I realize that you have been quite a mariner yourself.
Yeah, well, moving with my mom, you know. So.
Yeah. I would say, firstly, that this is the first time he's been honored in this way, and we will talk a little bit about the kind of agitation that he had given or was responsible for when this country was still using vessels before that time, like the SS Trinidad and the SS Tobago, and he was very much discomforted. He was very concerned. He felt that it was a bit of wretchedness for us to be using those 2 vessels, the SS Trinidad and the SS Tobago, to ply passengers through across the waters between Trinidad and Tobago. And that is just one of several different things that he agitated for. So let us go back to the beginning and just talk to us about what you knew about his early life. Yes, I've written the book.
Right.
But indeed, while I am the biographer of Governor Fargo, just give the orientation or the awareness you have of some of those more colorful aspects of his life before we talk about the political side.
All right, great, I understand. Well, as you mentioned about the boat, I would know about that because, I mean, that was in my time, probably your time or your parents' time.
Research.
Yeah, of course. So I could talk about those vessels that I would have traveled on, but I could give you some insight based on, because I would have been speaking to family members and they would give me stories. There would be flying stories in my head. Of course, being named after my grandfather, it's a mantle, so to speak, that was you know, difficult in the sense that big shoes to fill.
Yes.
I attended El Dorado Hindu Primary School, and then I transferred from there when my mom decided for us to move to Tobago. And I attended Scarborough RC Primary School. And, you know, obviously coming to Tobago, everybody, the community, the teachers, the family members, the neighbors, everybody, what? Your name is APT James? Your mom named you after APT James? That was just the reaction of my teachers and parents of my fellow students in school. Their parents would be like, what? And they shake my hand rigorously, and like they're so proud that you know, someone carried on the name of APT James, because people don't usually do that. Right. And that name was a very long name. It's Alfonso Philbert Theophilus James.
Right, so you all get that on the P is Philbert.
A is for Alfonso.
Because everybody largely knew the Alfonso.
P is for Philbert, and the T is for Theophilus.
Right.
Right. My mom, which is APT James, I think his third daughter also, she was named Berenice Theophil Maria James. Right. So she had BTM James, and it was APT James. But notice what they did: Theophilus, and then they removed the last, which is the masculine, and
put Theophil.
Theophil. So that's the female version of that name.
Right.
You know?
So a little bit about you. Before, as you said, you started your education, primary education in Trinidad, then your mom transferred to Tobago, and you continued schooling at Scarborough RC.
Yes.
So in the case like your grandfather, you two went to an RC school because he went to the Patience Hill RC, which was the only school, primary school in Patience Hill at that time.
And then he moved on to become a pupil teacher at the age of 16 going on 17.
Right.
And then he would have retired, resigned. I can't say retired, he's so young at the time, at the age of 18. And then he moved on eventually to Brighton, the company in Trinidad at Lake Asphalt in Port Fortin. Right. But APT James, in terms of his education, the fact that he was a pupil teacher, even though he probably would not have gone to university like his friend Ian R. Robinson, who would have studied at Oxford in London in England, he still would have been respected as an educated person in those days. In those days. Because in those days also it was classism. As you said, if you didn't own a piece of land, if you weren't literate that you could read and so on, voting was out of the question. And socialism, they had socialist parties and all this sort of thing. And your status in society, in terms of what you would have been allowed to do, or places you would have been even allowed to go, because it was an extension of racism. Because remember, it's post-slavery days, and the black man still hadn't established himself in society in that time. We had black soldiers that left Trinidad and Tobago, and when they came home, they would have experienced the whole thing about the classism and the socialism. I could give you an example, a story that was given to me from a family member. APT James would have gone to a party, right, with all his friends and his union members and so on. And he, of course, would have invited a few of his friends from Tobago over. And at that party, I think it was, I don't know if it was SWTU Hall or whatever they had back in those days, right? It was the oldest one that they have still existing. I think it's the OWTU Hall or SWTU Hall in Port of Spain. So all the big events used to be taking place there. And at the bar, they were refusing to serve his Tobago friends because they're from Tobago. Obviously, they're dressing different. They don't have the same clothing in terms of being astute, and so on. And they would have refused service to his Tobago friends at that bar. And one of his friends complained to him that how they were being treated, and he was peeved. He went over to the bar and he said, well, if this is what is taking place here, all of us are one blood flowing through our veins. He said, okay. He bought the bar. Yes. He bought the entire bar, and everyone would have drank free.
I have that anecdote in my book. Right. I have that anecdote, and I would say, yes, you're spot on with that. As a matter of fact, one of the things that influenced his life as he moved into the political arena is that there was a bus fare incident in Tobago in 1945.
I can give you that one too.
All right. So I did capture that in the book, and indeed, he stood up for the rights of the people, indicating that at that time the Trinidad Government Railway, I think that was the name of the bus service, would not have been doing justice to the people in that route. The funny thing about that, Mr. Phillips, he only found this out upon his first return from doing his job in Trinidad at Lake Asphalt. So after he would have garnered a lot of wealth, accumulated a lot of wealth, working hard in the oil fields, even being promoted from laborer to stevedore contractor, and then on to contractor himself. When he came home, his first bus ride back to Patience Hill, he's back home. It's like, oh yeah, he came back home and he traveled on the bus, and the bus stopped halfway to Patience Hill, probably up by as far as the where the roundabout is now to the hospital, which is halfway up the hill to Patience Hill. That is not a full fare.
So he said, well, this is what is going on. He asked the driver what is going on here. And the driver said, well, you know, so the road is impassable, and so on and so on and so on. But he said, if you're charging the full fare of 10 pence, this is not acceptable because poor people work hard for their money. So here what? He stood by the door, and you know he was a big strapping guy. So he could have bent a shilling with his thumb and his forefinger. Right. He was that strong. He said, everyone pay 5 pence because we are halfway home, so we'll pay for the halfway fare. Yes. So they paid 5 pence, let everybody come off the bus, and they walked the rest of the way. And that continued. He started a little protest.
Well, as a matter of fact, that was one of the things that galvanized him to the forefront, that put him at the forefront of consideration for the elections the following year. Because in 1946, Trinidad and Tobago got the right to vote, the free vote. Before that, it was property. Property. Right? So you could not...
And social status, if your family name good.
So you had a certain mark that you must have paid, a sum that you must have been worth to become an elector, and a higher sum to become a candidate, you know, to stand in the elections.
Yes.
Now, these are colorful tidbits that you're bringing in. And there's one other I would like you to comment on if you know anything about it, and this is in relation to his involvement. He did become a very rich man, but in terms of his work in Trinidad as a wealthy contractor, he was also able to contribute to improving the lives of people in Labray. Did you have any tidbits? You all got any of those tidbits in your dialogue?
In fact, I could go so far as to say he would have developed his reputation in Point 14 and Labray by extension. The persons in South Trinidad were equivalent to the persons in Tobago. He felt at home in Labray.
Yes.
In fact, his only wife, so to speak, his second wife, I should say, well, his last wife, would have been from Point 14, Labray.
Right.
Elizabeth, who he would have married. That was, when he died, that was the wife he was with.
Okay, that was his wife at the time.
Yes, you know, and APT James would have developed a reputation for being a hard worker, as you said, being an astute union leader. Yes. In fact, when W. Bus Butler would have made jail on several occasions, because you know when you're fighting in the union and you're standing up for the people and so on with the government of those days, and still under the creed, you know, colonialism was still taking place and so on, and they would work together because he being from Tobago, Uriah Butler from Trinidad, and they decided that okay, when I am arrested, this Bus Butler speaking here, he would be the one running the party. If Butler make a little 3 weeks jail or 2 months jail, depending on whatever the charge, the APT James would be the man running things until Butler came out, and to ensure that while Butler was inside, he was well taken care of. You know.
Yeah, and that is part of that kind of relationship was highlighted in my section on his role in trade unions and associations and campaigns. I want to ask you, what is your understanding of the reason why people refer to him as governor?
Governor Fargo. In fact, even the house that the last house he was dwelling at when he died is known as Mills Guest House up at Coiler Street on the corner of Coiler and Young Street, Scarborough. Everyone knows that that house sat on top of the hill looking down on the port. You know, and then those days it would have probably been more scenic because you wouldn't have had all the buildings like the fire station and all those other buildings, modern buildings blocking your view.
Yes.
So you could imagine us traveling back in time. Let me say 1958 around there. You know, in the prime of his life when he would have, you know, accumulated most of his wealth. You know, he had horses, he had a hotel in Mason Hall. I noticed, you know, you're talking about him being a philanthropist and a ladies' man. Of course he was a ladies' man.
Yes.
He had 9 official children and 13 off the book, so to speak. And I say 13, I mean 10, 11, 12, 13. So 4 off the books that we acknowledge, but 9 officially in terms of having his name attached to their birth certificates.
I see.
However, each woman that APT James or lover or child mother, as they say, that he would have had, he ensured that they were well taken care of in the sense, not just only paying the rent or paying the bills or so. He also, once he had a child with them, he made his business to ensure that they were taken care of and they could take care of themselves. So he would even have a small parlor or a shop, a little grocery in the village built, and his lady friend with that child would run that parlor, and he would furnish that parlor with goods and so on, and teach them how to run it, and they carry on. Right. So therefore, they have a house, they have a little piece of land, and they have a business. So they would have been taken care of. In fact, Gordon Grant, if I could use that name because it's no longer a business, right? So it's not like if I'm Gordon Grant, if people would remember, and obviously this generation wouldn't, but Gordon Grant is one of the was the premier hardware in Tobago in those days. As far as the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, I think they would have, right? Gordon Grant would have, he used to issue what you call soft loans, meaning a loan that you don't even have to pay back because it's APT James.
Yes. If
I, as Governor Fargo, helping out my fellow man and so on, you own a hardware, and every time I lend you, hold a 10,000, hold a 5,000, I know you're under some strain, and I telling you, nah, it's all right, forget about that. When time come and I need to have my mansion built, you think is a problem? The supplier is Gordon Grant. Yes. He's the hardware man, so therefore those soft loans would have turned into, it's like a bartering system.
Right.
And back in those days, money accumulated to, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. And then obviously he wouldn't have a problem.
But he was a very enterprising man. But just, is there another factor that you could ascribe to why he would have also been called Governor Fargo by the people around?
All right, I'll give you another story with regards to that. Well, I was talking about mostly big businesses and his relationship.
Standing, his social standing.
Social standing.
Yes.
Also, like I said, he would have developed his reputation in Point Fortin, in Labrie, right? So what he used to do, he has his workers, as you know, when he became civil work contractor. And he would pay out all his persons on time, all his employees on time, all his laborers on time. And everybody in those days likes to gamble. So you're playing checkers, draft was a big thing back in those days. Yeah. And he would, if I give you the pay now, when payday and everybody lineman, probably the Friday month and whatever, he would gamble with these gentlemen and win back the same pay that he just paid them.
Right, I have noted that as one of the anecdotes. Yeah. And quickly I want to say there's one other thing. He was also an owner of horses.
Yes.
Tamino was apparently one of his most successful horses, and he raced at Sherburne Park. And in those days, people did not associate ownership with black people.
With black people.
Not certainly it would have been like, the more established families that had ranches and so on, and they therefore started to have horses and they would breed. So between 1930 and 1938, and the time of his death, he was very much involved. But he also had a very, very successful horse that won the title or whatever they have in horse racing in Tobago. Tamino.
Right, that was the name of that. That was a thoroughbred, and probably one of the only thoroughbred horses throughout TNT, not just in Tobago.
Right.
Because there would have been few and far in between.
Right.
And what you would have had as well too, in terms of the owners being mostly what you call Trinidad white.
Okay.
So a black man owning a horse, or horses I should say,
yes,
it was virtually unheard of. And back in those days, for pleasure
in particular.
Right. Starting gate, I don't know, well you would know,
yes,
but for those persons who don't, we can mention it, because that's closed down as well now. But the property is still down there at Sherburne Road.
Yeah.
Right after you pass where the licensing is on the right hand side, if you're coming from Crown Point area.
Yes.
That area there was the area designated for horse racing.
Right.
That was the only
we had a left-hand racetrack in those days.
What do you call it?
A left hand.
Left hand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Left-handed racetrack.
Right.
All right. So I need to ask you about Philanthropic. His philanthropic contribution, as far as you remember, the stories that have been circulating in the family. What were some of the social causes that he would have been identified with?
Right. Well, as I was mentioning before, with him gambling with his employees, right? Now you would think that is wickedness. That's like a con man kind of behavior. But when he won that money from his laborer, he would give it back to them.
Okay.
Because obviously he doesn't really need it, but he knows. So technically, it's like you're teaching him a lesson in a sense. He give it back to them, and they're owing him, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. I'm not in his mind, but that's how he used to operate. And his gracious, his giving, he had a giving nature.
Yes, he did.
You know?
As a matter of fact, I know that Tony Bishop because I had that quote in my publication.
Or Bishop's estate
Tony
in
Bishop
the family, yes.
Says that he's the only politician he ever knew of who went into politics rich and came out poor. Right? Because he was such a giver. Now, APT was also responsible for supporting a school in the Roxborough Secondary, in the Roxborough area, secondary school in Roxborough area. And I gathered this from Horace Leighton Mills. He also assisted several children. He may have had the equivalent of a GATE program.
He was like the godfather of Tobago.
Yes. He would have bought school books and so on.
Uniforms.
Assisted scholarships, assisted
classes.
Things for the children to go to school, because remember, still in those days, there was no free secondary school. Although Scarborough Secondary opened around the time he died, the point is that people were paying for secondary education, whether they were going to Bishop's High School or they're going to the Adventist school or whatever.
From what my mom told me,
yes,
it bothered him immensely to know that, all right, this person from Roxborough has a son that's brilliant. They might have 5 children, and this particular son, brilliant. And he can't go forward with his education or explore his full potential due to the poverty.
Right.
So he would step in because he wouldn't like to know that this person could have contributed to society based on their intelligence and if they, had sought education. But because they couldn't afford it, he would have stepped in and assisted.
Okay, so with only 1 minute left, I want you to tell us what are some of these things that are represented here on the table,
right?
Memorabilia that you brought and so on.
First, I would go with this book, right? This book by yourself, Mr. Andre Phillips. I must thank, because I remember when you did this book in 1993.
Yes.
I was third form, going into fourth form student from Scarborough Sec to Signal Hill Senior Comprehensive.
Right.
And this book represents the first documentation, official documentation, widespread about my grandfather.
Right.
Before that, there was only a small paragraph about him in the Republic Reader's school book that will use across primary schools throughout TNT. Yes. Which is a little paragraph, probably about 7 lines. And when you doing social studies in school, that is where you have the reference, which is not really much information.
Okay.
So when you wrote this book, I was most proud, and I read this book over and over. It felt like if I was in the story, and I really appreciate that. The second thing, which is his most notable award, is the Shakonia Gold Medal, which is now known as the Trinity, I think the Trinity Cross.
No, the Shakonia Gold Medal is the second highest award.
Right.
After what used to be the Trinity Cross.
Trinity Cross, right.
And now it's now called the Order of Trinidad and Tobago.
Order of Trinidad and
Tobago. So he has the Shakonia Gold Medal.
Right, the second highest medal. It's still in mint condition because we only bring it out for...
We are honored to have this on the set.
Yeah, right.
All right, good.
Yeah, you could heft it, as I say. And we have the presidential seal by His Excellency Nur Muhammad Hassan Ali, who was the president of Trinidad and Tobago at the time.
This was awarded.
And this is something that you don't see anymore. This is the presidential seal because, like as I said, they use polymer these days for official documents, for example, their birth certificate and so on.
Right.
But back in these days, they used to use the presidential seal, where they stamp it and so on a document. So this is the official document for community service. He was awarded this posthumously after he died. 1993, he died in 1960.
And that is just, the community service is just a angle,
it's
one
angle.
angle.
Wide, it's hard to really put it in a bracket what he did for Trinidad and Tobago. So let's say community service, but we know it was in trade unionism and all of that. This is the official invitation given to my mom and a guest, and she took me as the guest, only 14 years of age.
Right.
And this was Tuesday, the 31st of August, 1993 at 6 p.m. President's House. It was really nice.
Wonderful.
We were sitting behind Sparrow, and in those days, they had the Galarashmi Calypso, and Sparrow had a Galarashmi haircut, and my mom was whispering to me, "Yes, Galarashmi," and I was like, "Mom, shh, he'll hear you,"
All right.
And this other award here is a Thc Gold Medal, so it's kind of pinned down inside there, but it's a Thc Gold Medal. I can't even remember what year it was.
This was before or after the...
After the Shakonia.
It was after.
It was the shoot. My mom received it on behalf of the family by Thc.
Now, how did you feel as we wrap up? Tell me, what was the feeling you had having to actually attend this substantial program to honor your father, who was now being awarded posthumously?
Yeah, my
and
grandfather.
31 years later, your grandfather is being honored. What is the feeling? Just take me through that.
I'm proud. I mean, yes, we always talk about the governments of Trinidad and Tobago and probably other governments in the Caribbean.
Yes.
Honoring their heroes and their pioneers after the fact.
Right.
But I mean, that's just how society is. I mean, I'm not saying we're accepting it. Eventually, we'll get from one place to the next.
Right.
However, it's needed to be done because the children, the future generations, they need to know about their ancestors and the struggle that was beyond their time.
And the following year was the commemoration of a bust in his name.
Right. At James Park.
James Park, and I have this here, which is the bust of. This is when the bust was established. I was invited to this in October 1994. I guess you all would have attended. Your mother would have attended as well.
Yeah,
when
I
that
was
bust was
behind her.
The sculpture.
I must commend Miss Cynthia Alfred.
Right.
Although the PNM being the opposing party to APT James in his time,
right.
It's very commendable that she, being from the opposing party, would have gone out of her way to have that bus erected, because it was sponsored practically by Louis Kim. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes,
the German, right? The German artist slash sculptor. Well, she's an artist as well because she does artwork as well. She's dead, so may she rest in peace. So she did that for free, but they would have had to procure the bronze material that was used to build the bust. The bust, it was made of bust and not a statue because, one, obviously financial setbacks because they had to get it sponsored, and two, the only official photo really of my grandfather, because he wasn't a guy, he didn't like photos, right? It's up to his chest area, so that's what they used.
Right.
And they would have taken photos of my mom and so on to get, like the more life 3D kind of when they were doing to get this sculpture done. And well, before it was just James Park, which was the old market,
right?
Which that's very significant and symbolic with all the people of Tobago communities coming together and trading and buying and selling and stuff. But
so
then they changed it from James Park, and they actually they didn't have no name before. They had no name, and then they come and they put the bust, and then they put some information, and then.
Well, it became James Park before they put the bust, and then they decided they had to have a representation. And indeed, I must say that community, Miss Alfred was among 7 people on this committee. It's called the APT James Monument Committee. And
well, I don't remember none of the other names from the committee, because I'm saying, like I said, Miss Alfred spearheaded everything, hands-on,
Right. Well, what happened is that they had a chairman called Webb Lewis. Right. Anyway, we have come to the end. We are out of time. It's been phenomenal speaking with you. Your energy and your recollection of things is startling. It really is profound. And we will continue to see what more can be done. At this time now, there is going to be a vessel. I think this is the moment when APT James's name will be immortalized, because the vessel, we expect that that vessel will be on the high seas for many, many years to come.
And it belongs to the country of Trinidad and Tobago.
Precisely.
We're not leasing it. We're not renting it. It's ours.
Yeah. I thank you very much for guesting with us today, and we look forward to engaging you on other initiatives where we can.
Appreciate it. Thank you for being here.
Yes. Well, viewers, we are now at the point where we are going to deepen the conversation about the life and legacy of APT James, Tobago's sole legislator from 1946 to 61. And I want to start off by making the point that, as you would have seen in the clip earlier, when we had the family conversation, or the individual grandson of the APT James speaking about the family's perspective of what he has done for Tobago. I just want to remind viewers that the research I did in completing the short biography of APT James, titled The Governor Fargo, was published in 1993. But the information was gathered while I was still at university 10 years earlier, completing a project in my bachelor's studies. And I had the opportunity to speak with several persons who were contemporaries of APT James. 3 of them gave very rich insights into his life, and they are highlighted as follows. Webb Lewis, W.E.B. Lewis, he hailed from Charlottesville, and that gentleman was very much around APT James from the earliest campaign in '46 as a very young fella, and played more significant roles with the campaigns APT James engaged in from 50, 56, and 61. Webb Lewis had a very good sense of all dimensions of APT's life. The other person, Lionel Mitchell, was an educator, and he had a role in APT James operations as a political figure. As a matter of fact, from what I understood in the conversation with Lionel Mitchell, is that he contributed to some of APT James' contributions, or the preparation of the contributions that he delivered in the House, in the legislature. And at that point in time, it was a legislature. In the latter years. Also significantly contributing was another gentleman, W.W. Sutton, who was the founder and president of the Amalgamated Engineering General Workers Trade Union. And he had a very good sense of unionist APT. APT James was actually the vice president of that union at one point in time. W.W. Sutton spoke volumes about a man who personally assisted his union and others, but he gave APT James credit. And of course, inside the family, there was a conversation with Loretta James Francis. And of course, she would have known of his existence in Labray because I believe that is where she grew up. And she also made very, very meaningful contributions to the work, the research that was done. There were other smaller contributions, but these are the major ones that helped to shape. And in doing this work, some of the work had to be corroborated by looking to see what clippings were in The Guardian, and in some instances, the whole story could be followed by looking at The Guardian, and in one or two instances, records of the legislature. But in the time that book was actually published, between the period when I did research, most of the research 83, until 1993, the 10-year gap, I found nothing being said about APT James, especially after James Park was named after him. There was no literature, and so I felt it my responsibility to go ahead and publish this work. And that is how Governor Fargo came onto bookshelves and other places. Now, Alfonso Filbert Theophilus James, I have given another meaning to the acronym APT. And it speaks to what I see as his 3 strands of his life. The advocate, the philanthropist, the P, and the T, teacher. Because in all of these areas, APT James was a substantial person and had roles that were worthy of commendation. Let's look at the teacher briefly. In terms of the teacher, well, he actually was a teacher because when he studied, he went to Patience Hill RC, primary school. And in those days, if you didn't have monies to go on to secondary school, your life basically, your education would have ended there. He had this special opportunity to continue because he was quite a good academic. He was a good student, and the headmaster wanted him to become a pupil teacher, so he remained in the system as a pupil teacher for a few years. It wasn't emphasized how long he was spent there. But that was the teacher at work in an institution. But he was a teacher in other ways. When he was in a library, years later working, APT James was actually doing life skills with some of the men there. He showed them the ways to prepare themselves, work hard, save money, and put it to proper use. And later on, we could say that he was also a teacher in terms of shopkeeping lessons he gave to several of the people who were fortunate to be able to get his assistants to run shops. So he was always about education. But in terms of philanthropy now, the role was far even more, was even greater. APT James would have performed a role of supporting students who had humble means with school textbooks to go to primary and in some instances secondary school. And this happened all over the country, all over the island, because he was a legislator for Tobago. Tobago only had one seat. So he did all of this, providing from his own resources school textbooks for these students. Philanthropic again, he was very much in the vanguard of creating a secondary school in the early 1950s in Roxborough. At that point in time, Roxborough the Windward had no secondary school. I understand, of course, that we had Bishop's High School, which was very well known and is based in Scarborough. And around that time, the Adventists had a secondary school operating. But beyond that, Roxborough and the whole Windward had nothing. And this man, APT James, put his own resources in play with the help of a couple others to actually conduct such a program. It did not pan out over the long term, but one cannot fault him for the effort. It was a massive effort to perform such a role. Philanthropic, there's this other area of APT James as a person who gave gratuitous leases of tracts of land to people who were impoverished and needed plots, space to build a shelter. Today, that may be the role of HDC. But this was a man taking his own land and assigning leases for spots for people to build on. In one or two instances, APT James actually gave land, gifts of land, to persons who were very close to him. In the case, the story was told by one of his family members the last time earlier, that mothers of his children all got gifts of land. That's the kind of person he was. So his philanthropy went some distance, a significant distance, and was very consistent from 1946 into his re-election in 1950, into 1956 in his final term before he lost in 61. Always using his own fortune to favor the people, or to let the people progress. And then I must say something about APT James in respect of his wealth. How did he get to that place where he could do so? Remember that APT James, it was stated earlier, but it needs to be emphasized, left Tobago and went to work as a laborer, and within a short while a stevedore at Brighton Lake Asphalt Company. He was therefore based at the port of Brighton. At that time, Brighton may have been the busiest port in Trinidad in the 1930s, and it was the place from which oil and asphalt would move out of the country. And so APT, Fargo James, was active there. I repeat again that he was called Fargo there because he had been named after this very strong heavy-duty truck that ran on the roads in that period, built by the British. And people said he was as strong as a Fargo, the truck. So there's so much to talk about, but we are going to concentrate on the advocacy, his political career, and I have a guest coming on the set now. So after the break, watch the interview with Dr. Rita Pemberton. I'm very pleased this afternoon to have with me on set a conversation on the life and legacy of APT James. We continue with this conversation because in the earlier period we spoke with a member of the family. Now I have the senior lecturer in the UE History Department, retired, and a author of so much of the history of Tobago and Trinidad. And she is going to chat with us a little bit about her perspectives in respect of the legacy of APT James. Welcome, Dr. Rita Pemberton. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, Andre.
Yes. Well, I know you've been following a little bit of the program that we have been doing, and I just wanted, therefore, to bring the focus. I spoke earlier about APT James. I put his surname as an acronym. I said he is an advocate. He is or was a philanthropist, and he was a teacher. And these represented to me 3 strands of his life. I just wanted your initial impressions of him, and then we will go from there.
Okay. For me, APT James displayed 3 very important characteristics. 1, he was absolutely committed. Having won the elections, keenly contested elections in 1946, he got into that as a full-time plus job. Also, he was a visionary. He took his political responsibility very seriously, and he sought to attain for the people he represented what he considered best, their best interests. And thirdly, you call him a philanthropist. I call him Lenhan personified, because that's precisely what he did throughout his career. Give a helping hand to all those who he encountered who were in need.
Yes, well, I very much appreciate the perspective on Lenhan, because indeed, in my title, my book, Governor Fargo, I have actually identified a particular chapter or section, because the book was divided into 3 sections, and I did highlight that he was in the vanguard of the trade union movement initially, and he had some philanthropic pursuits there as well, and in the section C, the legislator. But let's take that first point that you raised and let us develop it a little more in terms of your view of him. The first characteristic.
He was a visionary. He saw that Tobago required certain developmental needs. So he didn't think it was the need a this or a that. It was a whole. And the package included communications. Communications internal, the road system was in a very poor state during the period when he was our representative. And also inter-island communication, really that was in shambles. So those were 2 issues that he pursued relentlessly. In addition, he felt that Tobago's agriculture should be developed, and he sought to get central government's support for that. he didn't succeed. He thought the cocoa industry should be expanded and made to be more contributory to the island and its development. He thought there should be fishing industries, not just fishing, but some processing, so he really took the game 2 steps further than what existed on the island and what the politicians on the other side thought for Tobago. So it was also where the public was concerned. There was a need for education and more education facilities on the island. And, that was something that he sang, and then to the point where he went and he founded a school in Roxborough in order to provide for the people.
Yes, and in terms of the visionary mindset from a man who had very little grounding in politics, and in 1946, let's just look at that period. Here he is in 1946, campaigning to become the first legislator of the island by open voting. And one of the candidates that was involved in this election in 1946 was the incumbent, Denobrica, who, right, yes. And Denobrica was there from the previous system, that is, on the basis of property. Yes. He was aligned to a party in Trinidad, and I think it was the party with Albert Gomes and Quintin O'Connor, these, yes. Right? And there was really no backing except the Butlerites, who were supporting, or APT seemed to align himself with the Butlerites and considered himself to be a candidate with the Butler Party at the time, 1946, the first election. What would you say was extremely significant about that very first electoral campaign that you recall and comes to mind?
Well, what was significant was the extent of participation. It was a hotly contested election. Mm-hmm. There was a large voter turnout. So, and the thing about APT James is just that he was seen as not just a people's man, he was the people's man.
Yes.
So I think his grounding with the roots of the society really is what carried him into politics. He had extensive support. I could tell you my own grandfather spoke about nobody else but APT James. I
hear you. And in this regard, he was able to win by a landslide. I think the person who had there was a teacher guy, Lawrence, who yes. Yes. who was seen as the best candidate. He went in with the best expectations to pull it off. And
yes, but he did.
The turnout was extremely significant. They said that the voter turnout was well in excess of 66%.
Yes.
Right? And here is this man campaigning in the first such general election in Trinidad and Tobago's history with a sense of what you may call a manifesto. And he had this manifesto highlighting a number of things that you just mentioned, to move Tobago from this backward state to modernity, so to speak. Now, so he won the elections and he went on. What did you think of his effort to, and what do you think is the long-term benefit of that, to take his own money as a candidate 2 years, as a representative 2 years into office, and go on to England to meet with Sir Arthur Creech Jones, who was then his Secretary of the Colonies? What is your take on that and its relevance for Tobago at the time and beyond?
Well, what that demonstrated is, well, to understand what that demonstrated, you have to look at what was happening. When James spoke in the House, he was really mocked, not taken seriously. And I mean, there was a perception that what he was asking for Tobago was simply too much, because in their minds, Tobago was a backwater and backwater it should remain. So he was determined. So going up to London on his own steam demonstrated the level of his commitment and his determination, but is also, to me, as someone who has been researching the history of enslavement, it was resistance. Because there you have these people who have formed their view of who you are and where you should be. And he was not about to accept that. So if the local authorities refused me, I was going to the higher authorities. I'm going up to England to let them know this was the situation. But the unfortunate thing about that is that, of course, they will know better. They were not prepared to appear to override the local authorities. And the color issue played out there. The class and color issue certainly also played out there.
Yes, and what I realized, while I didn't have the substance of his contribution or the letter he wrote to Sir Arthur Creech Jones, I did subsequently get it, but I didn't have it at the time I did the program. And there were a couple things in which I just want to highlight here that form part of his manifesto and the letter. He spoke of the need for an improved health service.
Yes.
The need for improved standard of primary education. The purchase of abandoned estates which could be divided into 3 and 5 acre parcels and rented out by peasants. Government should purchase the agricultural produce and offer soft loans to agriculturists. And he also felt that there was need for improvement in telephone communication, which at the time was in an atrocious state. This is 1948. He also talked about the development of the harbor and improvement in vessels plying between both islands. So these, some of these things he identified in his manifesto, so to speak, of 1946, and they were crafted into his letter to Arthur Creech Jones. Let us just look at a couple of those infrastructural developments with a deeper eye. This was the state, and by the time we got to the 1956, the third election, what was already on the ground that you could recall that represented results from his agitation over the years?
Well, the truth is, in a nutshell, absolutely nothing had changed. And I mean, it was something that Eric Williams had to admit when he came into office. So the sea communications, it was really bad. The state of the ships, just told you that somebody didn't care about the users. The state of the island had not improved despite the preachings and the implorings of James. And so nothing really had changed. And that prompted the government the PNM government to institute a Tobago development plan. And it did not go really where APT James wanted. But the tide was flowing by 1957. Some things had changed. People's views had changed. Although APT James had made a sterling contribution to Tobago on his own, still people, especially the younger generation, wanted more, wanted something else.
Okay, so before we go a little further into the events after 1956, there are just two other things I wanted to capture in the earlier period. Now, he was aligned with Butler for the 1946 election. And then by 1950, well, Butler had faded from the, this spotlight. I think he also went off to England. And the period was now one where the Tobago, the Trinidad Labour Party was coming to the fore, and Mr. Fargo James entered into a new alliance with people like Victor Bryan and these guys from the Trinidad Labour Party. So what I was saying is, do you feel at this point in time he had shifted from union type politics into a more mainstream politics in an effort to get Tobago's program further ahead? What is your comment about his alliances at that point in time, 50, 56? And by 56, of course, we realized he was starting to make little inroads with the DLP. But before that, what is your comment in terms of the post-Butler era?
Well, first of all, he had several kinds of alliances.
Yes.
Because, you know, he was vice president of the Caribbean Socialist Party.
Right.
That's one. And he was also, in 1950, he founded a party, the Tobago
Citizens and Peasants
Political and Economic Party. So he recognized the need to have a wide base. But in terms of getting things done, he also recognized that he need to hook up with people of influence.
Yes.
And in the Legislative Council, he sort of voted with that group against whoever else was in opposition.
Right.
I think it was a strategy to get things done.
One has to recognize that although the prevailing view is that he was not a learned man, the point is that he used his cunning to create the kind of alliances that would at least push the case a little stronger as he moved from his first term into his second term, and then when he won that battle against Robinson in 1956, he certainly was revered, and this was the governor at work. This was his ilk as Fargo James, governor of Tobago, was extremely strong.
Well, I don't know why there's so much emphasis on the fact that he was not lettered. The man was absolutely intelligent, and he used his intelligence. And I think that's one of the things that you need from a politician. I mean, there are some who are very lettered, and some of the things they do don't give credit to the certifications that they claim to have had. So, but the sort of way he saw things told you that there was a brain at work. He looked at the society, he assessed the needs of the society. The problem he faced was to be able to convince the power brokers, because after all, he's a lone representative from Tobago. And so most of them in the Legislative Council held the view that Tobago was really supposed to be just there. There was nothing significant. They weren't interested in, they didn't give consideration to the welfare of Tobago. And they didn't feel the passion that James felt.
Yes, and that is understandable. Now, all of this is happening at the time when the country had 11 constituencies up until 1956, I think it was. There were 10 in Trinidad, and James was a Tobago legislator in what was the Trinidad Legislative Council. This is before Parliament. So people had to understand that that was the name. He was legislator in the Trinidad Legislative Council. But looking at 1956 now, with the advent of the PNM and his approach, how do you believe, what do you think was a core, because there was an individual who was very popular in his camp at the time, was very much a support to him. Although I was told he didn't have much of a campaign strategy against the PNM, he was still able to win in 56 when the PNM was ruling in this whole new approach of modern party in the election campaign, especially in Tobago. Webb Lewis, W.E.B. Lewis, and Lionel Mitchell, who was an educator in Scarborough, they were two of the strong people in his team. As a matter of fact, I recall Lionel Mitchell telling me in his interviews that he had written or assisted with a couple of his contributions, preparing the contributions for the debates. And Webb Lewis was more or less assisting him as campaign manager in campaigns and writing some of his speeches for the campaign. What comes to mind when you look at the thing that carried him over the hurdle in 56 to become the 3-time representative, and juxtapose that against what happened in 61?
Right. But in 56, and from 56 onwards, one of the things he articulated for very strongly was representation for Tobago, because he realized that he was the lone voice in the wilderness of all those planter types in the Trinidad Legislative Council. And he thought that the island needed to have more than one voice speaking on its behalf. And that resonated with the people. So he sort of gained, traction with the population. And then you will recall that he was also a member of the county council.
Oh,
right?
the county council as well.
The county councils. So that was an important link with the people. So he kept touch on the ground. And therefore, his support base remained in place. People heard him speaking in Tobago. People knew he was devoted to their cause. And so they willingly gave him their support right through across the 50s. At the end of the 50s, then things began to change.
I believe that from looking at him through the eyes of the Philanthropic, by 1956 he had some success in that his agitation led the authorities to build a Hillsborough Dam. We had a small thing in 1926, and by 1952 the new dam had opened. And yes, in that period too, around 52, 53, the generating station, the electricity generating station was finally open, and there was electricity going to most of Tobago, at least the parishes that were on the leeward end, and you still had problems with electricity in the northern areas beyond Moriah. And he had some success too with the wharf in 1953, and I picked this up in the works of Constance McTeer. She wrote the Bocas and the Bulldog.
Yeah.
And she talked about, and because this is very important, since we want to understand why he is named, why a ship has been named after him. His greatest amount of advocacy in the House, his contributions were around the issue of sea transport. So in 1951, there was a sea transport committee that was established, and he was named on this committee, and it had some merchant as the head of the committee. And that is something like today's cabinet committee. He was on this committee from 1951 to 57, and some of his agitation really went through because he was speaking with the voice of 3 or 4 persons to Albert Gomes' administration, and then by that time things started to happen. What therefore would you say is what else has happened along the lines of his agitation for sea transport that makes this decision to award him or commission a vessel in his name so significant?
Well, what is very significant is that his advocacy for a better shipping connection between Trinidad and Tobago was always there. It was from day one, and also one of the last things he sought to attain whilst he was in the House. And secondly, it was something that the people felt that was needed. One of the problems Tobago faced was the high cost of items, and therefore it was important to have a constant supply. But given the irregularity of the operation of the boats, stuff did not always come in at the rate at which they were needed. And persons depended on that shipping line for a living, all the persons who sold items in Trinidad. So you needed to take items down to sell, and you needed it to bring you back with the items to offer to those who had shops and parlors and what have you, to offer for sale on the island. And so that was something that was near and dear to the heart of everyone, because everything you needed in Tobago in that period, you had to get from Trinidad. So the shipping line was a lifeline. So it was recognized, the importance of it was recognized by the peoples, the administrators of the period. They recognized the importance and the role that James played, and that is why the decision was to name the boat after him. Now, you know, there have been some arguments, but what I see is that it recognizes James's contribution, and finally we are going to have a boat that has been designed specifically for this service, and we didn't have that before.
And in this regard, let us just spend a couple of minutes looking at the aftermath and any parallels we see from what had happened. And I want to just introduce one. When James was getting ready to contest the 1961 elections, understanding that part of his agitation was for 2 seats, and finally this was on the table, there was an increase, I think, to about 18 members of the, 31 members of the general of the country in terms of the parliament. And Tobago was now getting 2 seats with that election. Before the campaign really got off the ground, noting that the SS Tobago and the SS Trinidad were pulled off the route in 1957, they were very, very poorly maintained vessels that were on the route for 22 years, and James protested ad nauseum. But the 2 years in between, they tried a couple of boats. They had something called the City of Port of Spain. They had that, and there seemed to have been some corruption over that vessel being used. But the government, now PNM, now Eric Williams, they did not answer with new boats until they ordered in 1959 for the Scarlet Ibis and the Bird of Paradise. Finally getting James' quest fulfilled, but with the PNM now able to take credit for it. In 1961, early 1960, I think the Scarlet Ibis was the one that went on first, and then the following year, before the 1961 elections, the Bird of Paradise was operating. What is your view of that, and how it may have helped to position the PNM in a more favorable light? And any parallels you see with the situation where Tobago is now getting 2 new fast ferries from the government, and look at the scenario in which it's happening?
Well, first of all, I don't think it was only the boats or the ships that made a difference. I think by the time we got to 1961, remember, James had tried with the Federation to have Tobago being represented differently, separately from Trinidad, and that didn't work. And he formed a party, and that party really didn't make any headway on the island. So I think what was happening is that the PNM, Eric Williams, had sort of instituted a new political culture where the emphasis was on the educated, because remember that was the PNM mantra, education for all. And that sounded a very important note to the population, both in Trinidad and Tobago. So up comes this young man who is highly educated and who symbolized, just like Williams did for the entire colony, symbolized where you could go with a good education. And more people wanted that. And I think that was an important factor. So James was sort of, on the downslide. And there was this emerging figure, this young, bright lawyer, Tobago educated. So that, I think that symbolism played a very important role. I would say far more than just the boats.
Right, and there was also the accompanying issue of James' poor political strategy for 1961, in that I think he contested the Tobago East seat when he was definitely more, he had not solid support in the West. Given all his philanthropic works, he had textbook program running for children in the areas that one would define as Western Tobago. At the time, he had tracts of land that he would give to persons to operate on, and so on, at peppercorn rates. And with all of that, he somehow chose to run against Robinson in the East.
Robinson?
Yes.
Yes.
And then, well, Basil Pitt was the person who prevailed in the West. And there seemed to have been a view that if, at least this is from Webb Lewis, that if he had altered and ran in the West, Pitt could not have beaten him. But he went against Robinson in the East. And Robinson's profile was already growing because in the 1958 federal elections, Robinson gained victory. Now that may have allowed the momentum to continue.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I agree with that. That he certainly should have chosen his much better than he did. And the thing is that Robinson also, had, apart from his own image, he had his father's, his father's sort of influence in Tobago East and in the northern side, and that served him well. And I don't think that James was able to transform into the new emerging political arrangement. It required something new. The old-time politics that he walked around and he spoke and he convinced people. But now, once you do that and people start having a vision of their own, people start forming opinions. Okay, he did this, we need schools, yes, but here is this young fella, this bright young fella. This is where schooling can take you. So we're going with him.
Right. So in the final analysis, when you look at everything pertaining to James's political career and his contribution, what would you say is his enduring legacy?
His enduring legacy is his commitment. If you are undertaking anything, and that is a lesson he's teaching, that he has taught all of us, you have an undertaking, you have a responsibility, and you give it your best shot. He had unswerving loyalty to Tobago. So he was interested in every dimension of Tobago. And when we say you say he had, before political parties had manifesto, he had a manifesto. I say he had a development plan. He saw how the island could grow holistically. And so everything he did was connected. So you have a road taking you all around the island so people could bring produce out and take things in, and they have a communication line going to Trinidad and back. You have representation where the problems of people could be articulated and channeled into the decision-making centers. And so what we learn from him is that commitment to the island, commitment to the job you have. You have those who have personally benefited from his generosity, and to remind us that Tobago developed as a lend-hand society, that you supported everybody. At one point, most people were like the same. You ate the same kind of, when corn season is corn you ate, when potato was in its potato you ate. The similarity of your economic and your social experience is the same. You went to church with the same people, you live in the area with the same people, you went to goat race with them, whatever else, you did it together. You had a funeral, you had a christening, you had a wedding, we were all there. So that cooperation, that cooperative spirit, and that strength of contribution and devotion to the society is what, to me, remains his sterling contribution, and a reminder to succeeding generations that if we want to get anywhere, that is where we have to go.
And well said. And I also feel that I want to just indicate that I sense his push for autonomy was very, very well articulated in that time, and that also had continued. Robinson took it into a different arena, and that his APT James or Fargo James efforts at that point in time found robust traction with A&R Robinson and Winston Murray coming into the late 70s when Robinson himself left the PNM. It's only that he did not call, he did not give credit, Robinson didn't give credit to APT James directly.
APT James.
Right? But he continued in with a new approach to the campaign for autonomy.
Yes, that is quite true. APT James called for autonomy, having tried and failed to work within the existing system. So because of the frustrations there, because he wasn't taken seriously, and because he wasn't getting any traction there, he thought, well, it is best for Tobago to go alone, to get to run its own affairs. Right? That was the basis for his articulation of that policy. And Robinson, when he came, eventually went that route, but remember, he too was part of the
ruling party.
PNM,
yeah.
Trinidad-based party, and they were happy to have a Tobagonian that had some standing to guarantee them those 2 seats. You know, so yes, the autonomy drive that is on now is a reflection of what APT James had started back then.
Right. And in closing, I just want to also say that the APT James may have taken or sought to take Tobago in another direction had he won in 61, because his supporters, Webb Lewis among them, they felt that he had a pulse. He was looking at the situation in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands and Jamaica were working to separate, because Cayman Islands was part of Jamaica in the same way as Tobago was with Trinidad.
Yes.
And I found it very interesting when I had that, when I delved into that further, because in 1962, when Jamaica went to independence, Cayman Islands stayed within the British Crown, right?
Yeah.
But in the final analysis, James showed, and this is a quote Tony Bishop made when he was interviewed by me, he said, James showed what a real politician ought to be in terms of representing his people. And he went further to say that James went into politics with all his wealth and may have come out very poor because he spent the money on the people of Tobago, his constituents.
Yes, but the thing is, James didn't go into politics to make money. He was already a self-made man when he got into politics.
Right.
And he willingly shared. I don't know how many politicians we have
That's right.
that kind of metal, but he certainly was an exemplar
Yes.
where that is concerned.
Yes.
You know, that all his actions were really totally committed to the welfare of the people.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing this time with us to reflect on the life of this very powerful and substantial figure, philanthropist, advocate, teacher, etc. Our first legislator who served for 15 years and covered all of Tobago as his constituency, Governor Fargo. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, thank you for inviting me.